Good morning. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Today we are on lesson 54 of the Acts of the Apostles, and we're covering Acts chapter 27, verses 27 through 54, and this one's called Trust and Obey. How we react when under pressure often will have to do with what pressure we have endured previously. When it came to shipwrecks, Paul was a seasoned veteran. That does not mean that Paul's courage came entirely from the previous shipwrecks, but that past experience was partly responsible. The most important variable in the equation was in all of those shipwrecks, Paul had seen God's hand. I have known many Christians over the years. Some of those Christians we would refer to as fat sheep. They sit in pews, listening to sermons every week, but they don't seem to grow. Let's say that their pastor preached the exact same sermon 2 Sundays in a row. Some of these people wouldn't notice. That is because they are not retaining the information. The only thing they retain is water. Part of that has to do with the fact that they are not applying the verses of the Bible directly to their lives. This happens much less frequently with self-feeders. What is a self-feeder? It is a person who is able to pick up the Bible, read it, and glean spiritual advice from it. Imagine a banquet prepared with the finest foods, but after sitting down to the table, we wait for someone to pick up the fork and feed us, like a mother feeds an infant. The meal is there, but not even the beautiful food, the amazing aroma, or our hunger encourages us to feed ourselves. Many Christians believe they don't have the intellect to study the Bible on their own. Instead, they rely on a pastor to read the Bible and tell them what it means, or most importantly, how to apply it to their lives. But that is putting all trust into the pastor. Without studying the Bible or knowing the Bible, how would we know if that pastor was teaching the Bible correctly? Self-feeders aren't fooled by false doctrine, false teaching, or false prophets. Instead, just as infants learn to feed themselves, baby Christians need to learn how to read the Bible and see what the Bible means to them. Fat sheep just sit there waiting for someone to feed them more. But without applying the verses of the Bible to our lives, it really does us no good. Paul had endured 3 shipwrecks before this one. God had been there with Paul through those shipwrecks, as well as through the other trials Paul had endured. And there had been many. After seeing that God had not broken a single promise and experienced God fulfilling promises in his own life, Paul's faith increased. In this passage today, we can notice that the sailors were panicking. They were ready to abandon ship. But Paul calmly and actively trusted in God. That trust was contagious. As we read this passage today, notice that a prisoner on board the ship seemed to be the one in charge. Let's read the first passage today. Acts chapter 27, verses 27 through 38 says this. Now when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. And they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little farther, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. Then fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing. Therefore I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. and in all we were 276 persons on the ship. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. I only have experienced being seasick once in my life, and it was during a storm that lasted about 3 hours. There's no chance I would have attempted to eat while seasick, knowing that as soon as food touched my stomach, it would have left my stomach. But imagine what the 276 people on board this ship had experienced for 2 weeks. No one had eaten for 2 weeks. Some aboard were crew, and experienced crew had been through storms before. That could be beneficial or detrimental. The benefit would be that they likely were not as sick as the others from the continuous waves and power of the storm. The detriment would be that they never had experienced anything like this before and had lost all hope, knowing that their deaths were imminent. But one of the most amazing parts of the journey has to do with that 2-week enduring storm of epic proportions. By looking at the map of Paul's journey, we can see that for the first part of that journey, beginning on the right side of this map at Caesarea, they followed the coastlines until they got to Cnidus. But after leaving Cnidus, they were in the open seas of the Mediterranean to Crete. In Crete, they had a nice, gentle south wind and decided to leave Fair Havens. Remember, Fair Havens was not conducive to stay for winter, and they decided to try for Phoenix and Rome if possible. But November 11th was the cutoff. Though sailing could be dangerous in mid-October, it was unheard of between November 11th and the beginning of March. But the south wind had fooled them, and instead of heading for Phoenix, they thought they could make it to Rome. Between Fair Havens and Malta, they were in open sea. That means there was no land or shelter that would cut the wind. On the open sea, they were completely exposed, and that is when a tempest hit them, a nor'easter of epic proportions. Earlier in Acts 27, we learned that they were no longer in control of the ship. The ship was completely driven by the wind, under the mercy of the wind. It is interesting that the Greek word for wind is the same Greek word used for the Holy Spirit, pneuma. They did not know where they were heading or even where they were located because they had not seen stars or sun for 72 hours. Of course, in those days, there was no navigation without sun or stars. In 1730, the sextant was invented, which measured the angle between the horizon and a celestial body. But in the days of Paul's voyage, the sailors read the sun and knew the stars, and that gave them directions. No food, 2 weeks of storm, and no navigation. That led to the hopelessness of the sailors and the prisoners on board. But notice the size of Malta. It is almost unnoticeable on this map at 122 miles square. Doesn't it seem miraculous that without the ability to navigate or steer, this boat ended up 1/4 mile from the shore of Malta? The sailors had worried about grounding on the sandbars and shallow waters of Syrtis sands, where many shipwrecks occurred, but the wind propelled them to Malta. We can see on the map that there was 300 miles of dangerous coastline between Syrtis Major and Syrtis Minor, and instead, in the 500 or so miles between Fair Havens and Malta, without steering or navigation, they bumped into land. Was that an accident? Or perhaps luck? No, this points to God's hand and the life of Paul. Once again, God had destined Paul to speak to Caesar, and God protected the heads of all those traveling with Paul. Once again, secular historians have spent much time studying Luke's description of what occurred aboard ship, as it reveals much concerning seamanship of that time period. Everything Luke described has been proven as factual, even down to the depth of the ocean near Malta when the crew was sounding. It seems that the crew was so panicked that they attempted to abandon ship and get away from the ship on the skiff, in the middle of a storm, in the middle of the sea, and in the middle of the night. But Paul told them if everyone did not stay on board, God would not save them all. By this time, the centurion had listened to Paul's promises and seen them come to fruition each time, and he believed Paul. He also trusted Paul. My guess is he would also learn to trust God in his life. This is the same process that occurs with each Christian. We begin with faith in God, but after walking with God, that faith increases because we continue to see that God does not break promises. No one had eaten for 2 weeks. Any strength they had left was adrenaline, and they would not last long. Paul encouraged them all to eat as it was for their survival. It's interesting that Paul broke bread and prayed and made sure that everyone knew where that food came from. They all would be swimming soon. I hope they had at least 30 minutes after their meal to avoid cramping. Paul promised that God would not allow any of them to be injured or killed. Once again, as Paul had explained before, that this information came from an angel of God, this was an opportunity for each unbeliever to experience the unbroken promises of God, and an opportunity of each believer to increase their faith by seeing God come through yet again. Let's read the final passage today. Acts chapter 27, verses 39 through 44 says this: When it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach, onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes, and they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. But striking a place where 2 seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest, some on boards, and some on parts of the ship, and so it was that they all escaped safely to land. Daylight must have been a huge relief for everyone on board, not really knowing how close they were to land. After cutting loose the anchors and hoisting the mainsail, they headed for shore and ran aground. But the waves were still so severe that they were crashing on the stern and breaking the ship apart. After all they had endured, it seemed that the soldiers were going to take a very bad situation and make it worse for the prisoners. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners. Why? Well, we have run across a similar situation in the New Testament. In Acts 12, Peter was chained between 2 soldiers, and in the middle of the night, an angel freed Peter, and he walked out of the jail. Herod Agrippa I had those soldiers put to death, which tells us that was the sentence to be placed on Peter, a death sentence. Roman law stated that if a prisoner escaped, the guard, soldier, jailkeeper, etc., would have to pay the penalty of the escaped prisoner. For example, if a man with a 10-year sentence escaped, the jailer would have to serve the remainder of that 10-year sentence. Not wanting to risk that, the soldiers planned to kill all of the prisoners on the ship, and that included Paul. It seems that the centurion interceded, as he had grown to trust and respect Paul. The centurion commanded that all who could swim should head for shore, and those who could not swim should get aboard a board or a part of a ship and paddle to shore. All 276 people on board made it to land safely. The spiritual lessons here have to do with trust. God told Paul that he would testify before kings, and more specifically, told Paul that he would testify before Caesar. Well, at the very least, Paul knew that he would survive this seemingly ill-fated ocean journey. But an angel of God gave Paul additional information, that God would spare everyone who was on the journey with Paul. Jesus appeared to Paul at least 3 times. And I think that Paul was much better in differentiating between the voice of Jesus and the voice of his own heart than most Christians are today. There are many who claim to hear God's voice today who are hearing what they want to hear, not what God is saying. To me, God speaks loudest through the words of the Bible, and we know that God never will conflict what he has told us in his word. In the days of Paul, they did not have the New Testament. In fact, Paul was in the process of writing half the books in the New Testament, and over half, if Paul was the author of Hebrews, as many suspect. We cannot stand on God's promises unless we know God's promises. And we cannot know God's promises unless we read the Bible. I saw a survey that said that 80% of people claiming to be Christians never have read the entire Bible. To me, that's ridiculous. I wonder if God feels the same way. When we think about what God has done for us, how can we live for him without prioritizing his words to us in the Bible? He wrote us a love letter, and to not be interested enough to read everything he has written to us demonstrates either complete laziness or that we have taken his love for granted. Paul knew the Old Testament, perhaps better than anyone. He also knew the New Testament, perhaps better than anyone, as he wrote it. He knew God's promises, had seen them in action, and walked in trust of God regardless of the bombs exploding all around him. We have one chapter remaining in the Acts of the Apostles, and it will not get any easier for Paul or for Peter, but that did not cause either of these apostles to trust Jesus less. This is Garry Glaub in Mooresville, North Carolina. Have a blessed day.